Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul. Hope you're having an amazing day. Finally, we have some benchmarks of Nvidia's RTX 40 series which have appeared independently online. And I have to say that while it's great that Nvidia themselves, of course, have released a ton of benchmarks of the RTX 40 series cards, at the end of the day, independent results are always much better. I will obviously say that it's best to wait for independent media to release their benchmarks, and perhaps even better, RDNA 3 to launch in November, but still, the results here are very impressive. And I want to begin the video though with something a little more fun, and that is some actual benchmarks of the 4080 16GB and 4090 SKUs which have hit 3 GHz with just a touch of extra power consumption. And we're going to get right into it after this message from the video's sponsor.
If you're running a copy of Windows 10 which isn't activated, of course, not only do you have to worry about the missing customization options, but there's also that annoying Windows desktop watermark reminding you to activate. Today's video is sponsored by WhoKeys.com, and they have an excellent price on Windows 10 Professional as well as Home keys. Yeah, and they also of course sell games. I've bought a few Windows 10 keys with my own personal account to test everything was legit and worked in preparation for this sponsored video. You can pick up one of their keys for 25% off using the coupon code RGT in the checkout. There's links to their website in the video description. Also, if you're building a few systems, there's bundles available too. Again, you can check out WhoKeys.com and use the coupon code RGT for 25% off the listed Windows 10 key prices.
So, as most of you know, the default power figure for the RTX 4090 is 450 watts. It's not exactly sipping on the PSU juice, but yeah, 450 watts is much better than the initial rumours for the 4090, which is 600 watts. But don't worry, you can get to those figures. You just need to overclock to 3 GHz. Some benchmarks actually of the 4090 hitting 3 GHz have appeared online. And well, yeah, you can see the power consumption figures yourself. Ouch. It actually pretty much adds up to the fact that the earlier rumours were that it was running on an engineering an engineering board, and basically speaking, they were just kind of cranking the clock frequencies up to see what the core and everything was capable of. So that does seem to be how they achieved, the 600 watts. Now, it's going to be very interesting because the rumour is, of course, that the 4090 Ti will actually hit 600 watts as well. So God knows what, that's going to do when you overclock the damn thing. But there's also been some benchmarks of the 4080 16GB model, which has also hit 3 GHz. At the end of the day, it's very early in the product life cycle, especially for overclocking. And honestly, these products are so fast anyway. Even if it was capable of doing this on a stock cooler, personally, I mean, if you feel differently, but personally, I wouldn't want my GPU to be like sucking down 600 watts of juice. Not only because of the power costs at the moment, but it just isn't worth it. Like, the card's already so damn fast. Maybe you'll feel differently. But the main focus of this video anyway is the RTX 4080 16GB results. A ton of them has appeared online, and now we actually have a pretty good indicator of how it not only performs in games but other tasks as well. So you can see the first benchmark which has appeared, and this is courtesy of Chip Hell, is Ada 64. There's not too much to say about this, but it is almost certainly the 16GB RTX 4080 that has appeared, and that's because of the number of SKUs which is being listed. Now, additionally, there have been 2 Firestrike results. There's a Firestrike Ultra and a Time Spy. I actually meant to say 2 3D Mark results. But anyway, 17,209 and 11,387. To put that into some context, the RTX 3090 Ti is around 80% slower, or if you want to compare it against the 3080 Ti, it's around 30% slower, and it's considerably faster, basically, the 16GB model. And if we compare it in Time Spy Extreme, videocards.com did a quite nice comparison here. Around 14,000 points for the RTX 4080 16GB model, which is putting it again at just about 23% faster than the 3090 Ti. Looking at the RTX 3080 12GB model, then it's 67% the speed of the RTX 4080 16GB. Damn, all of these numbers are nice and confusing to read out loud. It goes without saying that Port Royal and everything else do really well too. And Shadow of the Tomb Raider also saw a couple of benchmarks, and we also saw one for Red Dead Redemption. Now, ultimately speaking, the performance results here are pretty impressive. Obviously, at the end of the day, there is a massive deficit in performance between the RTX 4080 16GB and the RTX 4090. It's very clear that the 4080 Ti will sit between the two. If I had to guess, it's probably going to be closer to the 4090 specification when it finally launches. And it's going to be very interesting, to be honest with you, what happens with the pricing with that, given... well, honestly, the 4080 16GB is so expensive compared to the 4090. Honestly, the 4090 is about the price that I expected it to be, but the two 4080 SKUs, they are actually a little more expensive. So it's going to be very interesting to see how all of this plays out, especially with AMD being hot on the heels with RDNA 3's announcement early November. The rumour is that RDNA 3, of course, is going to be announced the 3rd of November, but then about 3 weeks later, as you can see on screen yourself, courtesy of Grayman, that's when we're going to see the GPU's release. I hadn't personally heard a specific release date, but I had been told basically most likely a couple of weeks after launch, and this makes sense. Generally speaking, you know, just as a product is announced, generally AMD, Nvidia, they typically give at least a couple of weeks. Even Intel with its 13th generation processors is like 2-3 weeks later. So honestly, I think it's a pretty good window that we're going to see these GPUs launch. Late November does make sense. Again, it's only going to be Navi 31 that launches, and then Navi 33 is going to launch early next year. Most likely, I'm hearing mobile first, but who knows on that one. I also just want to touch on some very interesting news from Intel themselves concerning Arc. Now, as I'm sure most of you know, the A770, the A750 has just seen a, benchmarks and reviews being released in the press, and the cards essentially are going to represent the highest end SKUs in the first generation of products. Battlemage will follow, and then after that will be Celestial. Actually, it's quite interesting that Intel gave so much of its roadmap available, in the public. Although, of course, it's not necessarily telling us all of the specifications. It's not like, hey, this is the clock speed, this is blah, this is the amount of memory and all of that. No, of course not. But at the end of the day, Battlemage is allegedly the GPU that a lot of Intel employees have a ton of hope on. In fact, I've personally heard that Battlemage is going to be where they try to get more... well, let's just say closer in performance to Nvidia and AMD, but Celestial is where they're actually trying to achieve parity or possibly beat it. At the end of the day, whether they could achieve this or not is, well, I don't honestly know. Mostly, as you guys are probably aware at this point, the majority of the issues for Arc, especially for the first generation, have essentially been revolving around the drivers. Now, the drivers are obviously something that the company continue to work on, and there's a very interesting video actually. I'm going to link it down below, and I'd encourage you to check it out so you can listen to Raja and his team discuss this in their own words. I actually would recommend you listen from the timestamp portion at the very minimum, but the whole thing is worth watching. But basically speaking, there's several takeaways here. The first is that the team does acknowledge, of course, and they have several times at this point, that the drivers need a ton of work. DirectX 12 performance is generally pretty good with the first generation of Arc, but DirectX 9 and 11 are not particularly great. As I'm sure most of you know, essentially it's running on an emulation layer, and obviously that A has overheads for the CPU, but it also is spotty in terms of how it deals with things on a game-by-game basis. And also, another interesting thing that was mentioned by the team is that the bring up and so on of Battlemage is going considerably smoother than the first generation of Arc. Alchemist. Now, that's not really surprising, because at the end of the day, you have a base to work from. And a very interesting thing that Raja brought up is that, like, they need to get the driver right now, because obviously you can't just throw faster hardware and then that's it, right? That's done. Because at the end of the day, the driver, I mean, I'm saying something pretty obvious here, but the driver kind of drives the GPU. At the end of the day, if you don't have the driver which is capable of sending the stuff to the GPU cannot go brr. So you can't just have a situation where the driver continues to languish in, like, well, crapville, and then the GPU's hardware, you know, just continues to like double or treble or whatever in performance. So that's something that they are very cognizant of. Again, it's whether they can achieve this. I personally think that there is a ton of potential for Arc. It seems that their ray tracing capabilities are actually pretty impressive. XeSS has potential. At the end of the day, they are fighting FSR2 as well as XeSS, sorry, as well as DLSS, excuse me. That's going to get nice and confusing. And also Unreal Engine and just about everyone. I'm pretty sure, you know, some dude at this point down your local, you know, takeaway is going to release a freaking upscaler. But it is very interesting to see how they are dealing with this. It's a very promising solution. And also their media coding capabilities look very impressive as well. Ultimately, it's what they can achieve. It's going to be very interesting, though, because, you know, at the end of the day, the problem is with... it's like a chicken and egg situation, right? Like, you don't really necessarily want someone who's not super familiar with the hardware necessarily to be the beta tester, but at the same time, the GPUs need to go to a wider audience. So it's like... someone has to buy the card if you want Intel to be successful. And I don't want to tell you guys to buy a product if you're not comfortable with it, because obviously that's not cool. You know, at the end of the day, the cards are relatively cheap, quote unquote. I mean, $300 is still not exactly, you know, free. But I also would say that if you're someone who's very familiar with PC hardware, wants to mess around with a new product, whatever, then I do think it is important to get a third player in the market, because at the end of the day, extra competition is only ever a good thing. I'm gonna make a much more in-depth video, I think, on Arc over the next while. I'm just kind of waiting to see how everything falls into place. It's a very interesting situation, I think. I think Intel's CPUs for the 13th generation are going to be very competitive. God knows how they're going to compete against Ryzen's V-Cache processors, but obviously that's an entirely different thing. They're most likely going to be more expensive, and they release later. And their GPUs do have a ton of potential. Personally, I don't necessarily care if they're as fast as, you know, the highest end Nvidia stuff or the highest end AMD stuff. I don't actually care too much. Even if Intel, just hypothetically, forever were releasing GPUs that were, let's say, roughly on par with the mid-tier cards or high to mid-tier. So taking the RTX 30 cards as an example right now, they would be like RTX 3070, maybe getting close to RTX 3080. I would be good with that. Because ultimately, the high-end cards are the high-end cards, but they don't exactly sell in high volume. Like, you know, the average person is not going to plunk down like $1,000, $2,000 on a card. And obviously, you know, cards like the 1060 historically have done really well. Vega 56 did relatively well, despite, you know, but, you know, they certainly didn't do as well as something like an RX 470 or a 580. You guys know the drill, right? So if AMD and Nvidia are fought against in that price range, I'm absolutely okay with it. But we'll wait and see. With that said, thank you very much for watching the video, and I'll see you soon. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.